So I'm Pam Dix. I'm the chair of IBBY in the UK, and I just wanted to welcome you and thank you for coming to this event, and to thank Anne for coming up with this creative idea, which has proved to be very popular and I think has a lot of mileage in ways that we can run it in all sorts of kind of format topics, but around reading around the world, which is after all what IBBY is all about. So it seems like a brilliant idea to me, and the last one was a great success, so I'm hoping tonight will be as enjoyable, and I'm sure it will, because we've got some really great people taking part. And I want to give a big thanks to the three of you for giving your time, because we really appreciate it, and your knowledge of books around the world is terrific. So I think it will be a really good evening. So I'm looking forward to it myself, and I'm sure you all are. My experience is that it's often better during a session like this to turn off your video, so there's less distraction around the side panel, as it were. And I want to say a particular thanks to Nicola, who's joining us from very far away indeed, and she'll explain that. But it's just, when I said three, I think there are four of you actually, so I correct myself. Or five is there? Oh, five of you. But we've been having a conversation about something completely other, and then she messaged me and said, I'd really like to join this panel. And I thought, well, this is real IBBY stuff, and we can have the opposite end of the world taking part in one evening. So thank you very much to everyone. Have a really good evening, and enjoy yourself. I mean, it's a good opportunity to use Zoom to its full advantage, I think. So I'll hand over to Anne. Big thanks.
Yeah, okay. Well, I can't actually claim credit for this idea in the first place. What gave me the idea of doing this sort of thing was I went to an event that was organised by the London Library. It was a literary festival. It was online. There's a bit of interference. If people could mute themselves, it'd be really helpful. Yeah. Okay, so yes, I went to this event, and there were two people, and they each spoke about 5 different books each, and they were all books in translation, but they're all books for adults. And I just thought, what would be a good idea to do something very similar within IBBY, and so we've kind of adapted the idea. We're not doing exactly how they did it, but they, flashed up the book covers and so on as well. So so tonight we've got 5 speakers, but I'll introduce them each when they talk about their first book rather than introduce them all now. So I'm just going to see if I can make sure I can do this thing with my screen share. Just a minute. And oh dear. Right. Oh yeah, can you all see that now?
Yes.
Great. Oh, that's really good to hear. So you've got the thing at the side there. Just want to try and get rid of that. I forget how to do that. So can you probably all see all the slides at the side? Can you?
Yeah, but not in full detail.
No, they shouldn't be.
And I think if you go to the top of your screen and go to slideshow and then click on that.
We can't read the small slides, Anne.
Oh right, that's all right then. Slideshow, and what should I do?
And then you just do play.
Play from current slide.
Play from start. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Okay, that should be all right then. So okay, that's the start. So first of all, I'm going to introduce Katerina Shatilova, and she's a graduate student at Glasgow University at the moment. But she's originally from Russia, and she's a translator, and she's the co-editor of the Russian Kids Lit blog. I think she works sometimes with Ruth Ahmedzai Kemp, who spoke on our last round the world tour, and in fact she finished our last tour with talking about some books from Russia. So I thought it'd be really nice if we started off where we left the last tour with some books from Russia. So Katerina is going to talk about some books that haven't been translated into English, and I've incorporated her slides into this PowerPoint. So that's the first one. So if you let me know, Katerina, when you want me to move the next one on.
Yeah, sure. So thank you so much for having me and for giving me this opportunity to talk about Russian books. Since recently there haven't been many translations of Russian children's books into English, I've chosen to talk those two books that I really like, and I think they're quite important, not just to me, but like to the whole country. So the first one is Sugar Child, written by Olga Gromova in 2014. Funny thing, Olga Gromova never wanted to be a writer. For many years, she worked as a librarian in various libraries and then as a chief editor of a specialized school library magazine. And she became a writer by chance when she met her neighbor, Stella Nadolskaya. Next slide, if we can. Nope. Here we go. So she met Stella Nadolskaya back in the 1980s, and Stella shared with Olga her story of growing up in a labor camp in Kyrgyzstan. And that story was so powerful and emotional that Gromova thought it should be documented. And Stella agreed, but on one condition. She didn't want it to be just another boring memoirs for grown-ups. She specifically requested it to be a book targeted at children. And at that time, there were no such books in Russian children's literature. So Nadolskaya first published her story in 2 journals in the form of 4 short stories. And these texts were very well received by the young readers. It prompted fan letters and requests for school visits. And so Nadolskaya, she continued writing her story up until her death, unfortunately, leaving it for Olga to finish and publish the novel posthumously. And so Sugar Child is effectively, it's a, can we have next slide, please? Yeah, no, previous one.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Sugar Child is effectively a Bildungsroman with elements of historical fiction and a school story genre that touches upon such important topics as Stalin's repressions and experience of surviving in exile, topics that still remain hidden in the shadows of Russian children's literature. A 5-year-old Stella, who is called Elia by her parents, together with her mother, she's sent to a labor camp in Kyrgyzia as her father is arrested as an enemy of the state. And first they were sent to the women's labor camp where they had to sleep on the ground under the open skies, and where Ella was beaten several times by the guards because she was standing too close to the wires surrounding the camp. After being released from the camp, Ella's mother couldn't find a job. They almost died of starvation and cold, but luckily one local family, despite all the risk, agreed to take them in. And later they settled in on their own in a small village in Kyrgyzia. Ella's mother found a job and Ella started going to school again and made friends. And that's how she got that nickname, the Sugar Child, which in Kyrgyz means a blonde girl with a very light skin. So she almost started to have a normal childhood, even though the danger of losing a job or getting arrested again was always there.
Oh, hi, sorry, I'm just in the middle of a Zoom. Could I call you back later, maybe?
Sorry, could you all mute yourselves, please? Because it's a bit awkward when people are speaking. Yeah.
I'm out tomorrow, sorry. It's actually quite bad.
Sorry,
I'll try you a little bit later, all right? Bye.
Sorry about this, yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, after all that, Elia and her mother returns to Moscow only after Stalin's death. And her father never returned from the camp, sadly. Despite the harshness of and cruelty of some scenes, this book is quite inspiring, full of light, because it's about love, about dignity and freedom, and it's about how to stay human under human conditions. And the book became an immediate hit in Russia. It has been reprinted several times, more than 10 times, and now includes different editions like children's editions and grown-up version, which is accompanied by scholarly commentary and archival photographs. It was distinguished by the prestigious national and international literary awards, including the White Ravens list. It's now part of the school curriculum, and it's also staged by some theaters in Russia. And next slide, please. It has been the rights to the novel has been sold to 14 countries so far, with 9 editions being already published, and some of them are still in the process of being published, but for some reason there is still no English translation. So that's all about Sugar Child. And if we go to the next slide. Yeah, so the second book is called Once There Was a Girl. It's a fictionalized account of Tanya Savichev's life during the siege of Leningrad. It was written by Ilya Miksin, who himself went through the war, and it was first published in 1992 and then reprinted in 2014 and 2020. 11-year-old Tanya Savichev is often compared to Anne Frank, although her diary...
Sorry.
My fault. Although her diary is, as you can see on the right, that was essentially a telephone book, and her diary was very brief and to the point and included only 7 horrifying entries about the deaths of her family members. So each letter corresponded to the family member. For example, M was for mother. So after her mother death in 1942, Tanya wrote, "The Saviches are dead, everyone is dead, only Tanya is left." For some time, Tanya lived with her aunt, who was more interested in their family furniture than in the life of a young girl. When she was going to work, she would just close the apartment and leave Tanya outside on the streets during the whole day. Eventually, she was sent to the orphanage, which was located not far away from my native town of Nizhny Novgorod. But Tanya was very weak and very ill. She lost her eyesight, and after being transformed to a hospital, unfortunately, she died in 1944. Tanya never found out that not all the Saviches died. Her brother Misha survived, and her sister Nina, her older sister, she also survived the war, and she returned home. She visited the aunt's apartment, and that's where she found Tanya's notebook. If you can go to the other slide. Yeah, these are all just those 7 entries. There was nothing else in the diary. So yeah, she found this notebook, which was also used during the Nuremberg trials as evidence of the Nazis' crimes. Tanya did keep a proper diary, but the family decided to burn it at some point because there was no fuel left and they need something to heat the stove. In his book, Ilya Miksin reconstructed everything that happened before, between, and after those scary lines in Tanya's diary. And to gather material, he searched for relatives, he visited archives, he talked to the survivors of the siege, he even sat at the desk in the classroom where Tanya studied. And that's how he got a very thorough account of her life, and very well written at that. And the new edition that was just reprinted, it's accompanied by illustrations drawn by the famous Russian artist Alexander Traugott. And they were drawn by him during the siege as he was a 12-year-old boy. So it's, well, in a way, it's a perfect edition for the book, even though perfect sounds is a wrong word to use in this context. I'm not aware of any translations of this book in any language, so correct me if I'm wrong. But that's all from me.
Okay. Thanks very much, Ekaterina. That's great. So what we're going to do is, rather than ask questions after each speaker, if you save your questions to the end, and then if there's anything you sort of think you want to write that down, you can put it in the chat. Yeah. So the next speaker is Becky Butler, Dr. Rebecca Butler, I should say. She's a long-standing member of the IBBY UK committee. And one of the things she's been doing is she's played a very valuable role in organising, along with Carol Thompson, the committee was also here. And they organised the UK nominations for IBBY's biennial book list of books on disability. So anyway, so Becky's going to talk. She's going to talk about another book later on, but the book she's going to talk about now is
while we're playing the cover bowl. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's right. I put, yeah, okay.
These I read in translation, and for anyone who doesn't know, I would describe them as a cross between the Danish Harry Potter and the Worst Witch with animals. And I read Wild Witch Wildfire to be reviewed in IBBY Link when it first came out, and I was captivated by the entire series because Clara learns. Basically, Clara gets scratched by a cat and discovers that she has a power, or she has the ability to learn the power to talk to animals. And as the series progresses, we discover that the animal world is in danger, as per normal, and all the animals need Clara's help. Can she harness her power and beat the various enemies she meets, or will she not learn to control her talent? And one of the most striking features of these books is because they're fantasy. Sometimes it's difficult to translate fantasy effectively, as I'm sure some of you know. But these, and I don't read Danish, these you can read and not realize you are reading a translation. We nominated Wild Witch for
Okay.
or was it the Marsh Award?
¿Y a qué conclusión llegaron entonces con Carlos?
It was I think it was the Marsh Award, and it won. When the first one came out. And apparently, thanks to Anne, there is a movie of the entire series, but it's in Danish with subtitles. I wish they would bring it to Britain, because when I finished the series, I gave them to a school that I was working in at the time, and the kids there in primary have really taken to them, and I just urge you all to read them. Not many people know about them, and I really got affected by them. And if you can't decide what to recommend to people who like either The Worst Witch or Harry Potter, which is a lot of people, try giving them these. They're brilliant.
Okay, thanks, Becky. It just the film that Becky just mentioned there. When I was searching for images to put on the PowerPoint, it's just something that came up that there was a film, and I didn't know about that. So, but it does seem it's not very widely available. So it's certainly not streaming in this country, which is a bit of a shame. But keep an eye open for that and see what happens. Maybe
if it was, I'd watch it.
Yeah, I'd like to see it too. So okay, so thanks for that. But Becky will be back talking about another book a bit later on, which is from a very different part of the world. So that those books were from Denmark, and they're published by Pushkin, and we'll be hearing from Sarah later, who is an editor at Pushkin. So the next book, let me just. So I'm now going to introduce Daniel Hahn, who many of you will know. He's an award-winning translator of books for children and adults, and he usually translates from Portuguese, Spanish and French. So I was very interested that the 3 books he's picked are actually, none of them are translated from the languages that he translates from. So there's a couple of other books when we get to Asia on our tour, but for now he's going to talk to us about a book by one of Italy's most famous authors, who but isn't very well known here, I have to say. Okay, so Daniel, over to you.
Thanks, Anne. Hi everyone. It's so nice to be here among many friends. As Anne said, I've got 3 books to talk about tonight, so I'm slightly greedy, I think, but I will try and be brisk about them. The first one I chose, as Anne said, is by a great Italian writer, Gianni Rodari, and I chose partly because I've just discovered this book, but also because I thought it would be nice to have a little IBBY connection as a past Anderson winner. Rodari won the Anderson. He was nominated many times, won the Anderson back in 1970, I think. And as Anne said, he was one of, I think, probably the most read and most kind of loved Italian children's writer in the 20th century. Every Italian friend of mine grew up with him and adores him, and is slightly baffled by the fact that we in the English-speaking world haven't really found him yet. This will be a common theme in all the books I talk about, I'm afraid. I have a slightly scratched record about this. But he is a kind of superstar in Italy, and there is this new book now which has just been published by Enchanted Lion in New York, which is called Telephone Tales, by Rodari, illustrated by Valerio Vidali and translated by Anthony Sugar. It's a collection of 70 short stories, which are sometimes funny, they're surreal, some of them are inspiring, some of them are quite melancholy, I think. And they range from the story of old Aunt Ada, who lives in a care home and feeds the birds every day. And it's a rather sad story because when she dies, the birds are the only people who remember her. There is the ice cream palace, which is not a palace in which you can buy ice cream. It's a palace that is made out entirely of ice cream and is set rather pleasingly in the Piazza Maggiore in Bologna, that anyone who's been to the Bologna Book Fair will know and will now be able to imagine a palace made of ice cream there. There is a story of Giacomo of Crystal, who is a boy who is born transparent, and as a result you can always see what is in his mind and in his heart, and therefore he doesn't lie, and it's a story about truth and politics. They're mostly quite gentle stories, they're very slight, sometimes they're often very inconsequential. They don't even always have a story as such, they're sometimes just a delightful and slightly odd conceit. What they have in common, all of them, is that they're very short, and there is a very specific reason for this, which is that we get a sort of frame story to introduce the 70, which is the story about Mr. Bianchi, Signor Bianchi, who is a traveling salesman who is always on the road, and he has a daughter back home, and his daughter can't sleep unless he reads her a bedtime story, and so he has to do this on the phone. And so every night at, I think it's 9 o'clock, he calls her up from wherever he is in the country and reads her a bedtime story down the phone. These are the 70 stories that Signor Bianchi reads to his daughter. And because Signor Bianchi is a man who's very careful with his money, he doesn't want to spend very long on the telephone because he's using a payphone, which is why the stories are all very short. The frame story gives us a reason for these very, very short stories that we're given. The only other thing I'll mention briefly is the illustrations. I don't know if you can see, I'm very small, I know, on your screens, but there are some beautiful, quite stylish, quite bold, slightly retro illustrations all the way through. And they've done a slightly odd thing with the layout. Some of them are, you may just about be able to see how it's integrated pictures there. But there are also some pictures that are just bound in as little separate things. Quite a few of the pictures are, and find one for you, there are kind of a few gatefold pictures. So a lot of the pictures you kind of have to find for each of these stories. It's a slightly odd, but rather lovely bit of production eccentricity. I don't quite know why it's like this, but I like it like this. That's it, Telephone Tales, Gianni Rodari. I will have more to say about the other two when we get there.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. Yes, I think there was also a book, is it called Grammar of the Fantastic or something like that, which is about literature, which is, I think there is an English translation, yeah, but yeah, very little of his is translated, yeah. Okay, into English, I should say, yeah. Okay. Right, so now I'm going to introduce Sarah Odedina. She's a publisher. She's well known in children's publishing. She's worked for Penguin, Orchard, Bloomsbury. She was instrumental in establishing Hotkey Books, but she's currently the editor-at-large at Pushkin Children's Books, which I mentioned earlier because Becky's books were published by them. And she's picked 3 very different books from very different parts of the world. So this is the first one. So Sarah, over to you.
Well, this is Hum and Swish by Matt Myers. Matt Myers is an illustrator. He's illustrated many books in the US before, but this is the first book he's also written. It's written and illustrated. And it's published by Holiday House, but it's actually a Neil Porter book. And for people in the children's book world, Neil Porter's name goes a long way in the world of pitch books. Why did I choose this? Well, there's a thing that British and probably American editors say to rights people when we're looking at gorgeous picture books and why we can't buy them, and we justify it by saying it's a little bit quiet. And I'm not really quite sure what that means, but I suspect the wonderful rights person at Holiday House has probably heard people say that about Hum and Swish, and it is quiet, and actually that's its shouting, unique pleasure. It's about a little girl called Jamie who goes to the beach. She just wants to be alone. And she just wants to poodle in the sand, and she just wants to listen to the sea, and she just wants to build things. And people come by and they're constantly asking her questions. What are you making? What are you doing? Aren't you clever? Isn't that pretty? And she always answers the same thing, which is, I don't know. She's literally just this gorgeous little child who's in her own world and is completely satisfied with that. And in this one day in the afternoon, a woman trots up beside her, an older woman who gets out an easel and puts a board on the easel and starts painting. And Jamie says to her, oh, what are you doing? And the woman says, I don't know. And they sit for the rest of the day next to each other doing their own thing. And it is so glorious because at the end of the day, they just celebrate the quirky, wonderful things that they've made without any interruptions, without any action, without any drama. It is so delightful. And one of the things I absolutely love about it is the way it celebrates intergenerational friendship, that the older woman and the little girl can just be themselves with one another, and there's no pressure, and it's perfectly normal and satisfactory. And it's a joyful expression of friendship and being yourself and being comfortable doing your own thing and not being harried by people. And I think the message in the book is one that we could really all enjoy remembering quite often. It's not published in the UK. I don't actually know if it's published anywhere yet in the world other than in the US, where it's an adorable book. I recommend it highly.
I'm often quite surprised by the fact that quite a lot of American picture books don't get published here. Even books that win the Caldecott Medal, that are their equivalent of Kate Greenaway Medal, they don't seem to cross the Atlantic.
I think the UK is getting much better at the international range of titles that we're publishing in picture books, and that we don't. I remember a very, very long time ago, David Teal, the wonderful David Teal, saying to me, the trouble with the British market is that it tends to orientate itself around bestsellers in which there's a little animal with a tear in its eye. And it was kind of brusque, but very honest appraisal of the British market. I do think we're able to move away from that a bit more now, and we're seeing much more interesting books like The Wanderer, the Pushkin title, which is the translation title, which is absolutely stunning. Sean Tan, absolutely wonderful. We're seeing a greater range of books coming through, but I think predominantly we still seem to hold on to the sort of rather more obvious middle ground of picture books. We're perhaps slightly less courageous about where we go. But I do think it's getting much, much better.
Yeah. Yes, I think so actually too, yeah. Oops, gone back a bit too, oh no.
Happening.
Hang on, I've gone a bit too far, sorry. Yeah. It's very sensitive, this thing. Here we go. So we've been in Europe, we've been to America, and now we're going to Africa for Sarah's next choice.
Well, we're going to Ghana.
Ghana, yeah.
Africa being a rather large continent.
Well, yeah, sorry, yeah, I've just meant we're going to a different continent.
Of course, enormous.
Yeah.
Ruby Yaragoka is an author in Ghana. She's incredibly well known in Ghana. She's the Jacqueline Wilson of Ghana. She is mobbed, children run after her on the street. And Even When Your Voice Shakes is her first international publication, and this book is being published by Norton Books for young readers. And it's a book for teenagers, for older teens, and it's the story of a girl whose family is experiencing very hard times, and help comes their way by a friend of the mother's who lives in Accra, who needs somebody to work in the house for her. So the oldest daughter of the family, Amelie, is taken to Accra to work in the house as a house girl, a maid. And when she's there, she's attacked and raped by the son of the woman she's working for. And she is immediately torn between keeping her job, collecting her salary, looking after her family, making sure that her younger siblings have food on the table and their school fees are paid and they're able to go to school, and challenging the very difficult conditions that she's in, and taking the boy to court. And she gets the help of a neighbor who's a lawyer, who encourages her to challenge and make a stand against this boy. And it's a book about gender politics. It's a book about class. It's a book about wealth. It's a book about access to power. It's a book about a young woman literally having the courage to stand up against a system that tells her all around her, everybody tells her she literally shouldn't be doing this. And yet one person stands by her side and she does, and she wins. And it's a remarkable story. It is literally told in a page-turning style. You're completely gripped by the girl's story. You know exactly why she's there. You care passionately about her social circumstances and the reasons that she's having to do this job. And you feel her injustice. And you also get to see through her story the way in which gender politics works to a certain extent in this situation and in society as a whole. It's a contemporary story. The events that are happening in this book could be happening now. And in Ruby's first draft, she didn't have the girl succeed in her trial against the boy. The boy and his wealthy family got away with it by paying compensation to her family. And when that was discussed with her, she said, but that's what happens more often than not. And it was suggested that she maybe think about how she could show the real positivity of what can come out of this girl taking her action. And that's how the book was finally finished. Norton have had huge success with this title. They've had extraordinary reviews. They've sold audio rights. There's all sorts of things going on around the book. Translation rights are starting to sell. It's sold in Brazil, and it's sold in Nigeria, where both countries are coming out with editions later this year. And I think this is going to be the first of many great books by Ruby. And I do have to actually say that I do have quite personal interest in this project, because Ruby came through the Accord writing project that I'm running with Deborah and Cora, who's based in Accra. And Ruby's one of about 7 or 8 wonderful authors that we're working with, whose books we are getting out to international audiences. And we're very excited by the fact that the uptake and the interest in the authors who are part of the Accord project is really very positive, but absolutely led by Norton Young Readers, who have created a list on their list, publishing in collaboration with Accord to be publishing these books. And there's writers from Kenya, Nigeria, Togo, Ghana, Zimbabwe. It's a wonderful project that Norton are doing, and I'm really proud to be able to say that I'm part of it, but mostly because what we're doing is bringing African authors with African stories about Africa, and very specific stories that would perhaps otherwise not have found the opportunity to be read in Europe and North America and the rest of the world, Latin America, Brazil. It's great, and Ruby's a real star. It's well worth having a look at this book. It's a really impressive novel.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Sarah. So Sarah's third choice is this book. So we're moving away from. Sorry, we've only got one book from Africa. I think this is something we need to address in future. We didn't have any at the last one, so we've been improving a bit, but we definitely need to have more books from different African countries to talk about. But so we're now moving to Asia, to India.
The Chowpatty Cooking Club is published by Duckbill. It's an imprint of Penguin India, Penguin Random House India. Duckbill used to be an independent publisher, and they recently joined the fold of Penguin Random House, which is probably a really lovely place to be. They're a great publishing outfit in India. And this is a tremendous detective adventure story set in what was Bombay in the 1940s, when India is fighting for independence from the British. And it's about three kids, three friends, it's just a delight, who are desperate to get involved in the independence struggle. One of the characters writes King of England and says, you know, why don't you all quit India? And the King of England, of course, isn't him that writes back and says, don't you worry, we are, and keep up the good fight. So neighbour writes back to the girl. And so these three children, they spend so much time trying to work out how they can be involved in the independence struggle. And they keep getting asked by their mothers and their aunties and their neighbours and their friends to run recipes and sample food around the place to one another for this cooking club, which they think is a complete waste of time, when people are running radio stations and publishing underground newspapers, and their neighbour got arrested. And anyway, at the end of the book, of course, you find out that they've had a very important role in running messages, literally, for the independence movement. And one of the glorious things about this book is the mix of history and fiction. The authors wrapped in, rather like making bread, real people, real historical characters, real events, real marches and protests on the streets of Bombay. The radio station that's a really crucial part of the story was a real underground radio station that was busy transmitting throughout this time stories that the British rulers did not want generally Indian people to be hearing about. And it's delightful. It's full of energy. It's got a sort of madcap speed, but never incredible. It's always entirely believable. And it's delightful to read a story that is so subtly educative, because there's no sense that we're being preached at or told.
Oh, not so much what's happened here. I don't know if they're
anyway.
To be seeing somebody else's screen. I don't know, Penny, I don't know how that's happened.
Anyway, I strongly recommend this and other novels by this author, because also she writes absolutely beautifully. Her ability to measure the clues, bring things out at just the right time, tiny things happen that later on you realize are hugely significant. And her writing, her voice is absolutely delightful. So the Chowpatty Cooking Club, definitely one to pick up, I think, but you'll have to order it from Amazon, I suspect, to get it. It's selling incredibly well in India. It was one of Amazon India's best-selling titles when it came out, and has stayed up at the top of the charts. But as yet, no rights have been sold.
Okay. Well, perhaps we can try. I don't know if Soma Books in London might possibly import it, because they have books from India. So perhaps we should talk to them about that. If there's no actual edition in this country.
It would be an absolutely brilliant book for schools, because, of course, there's so many reasons that we need to know stories like this, enjoy stories like this, and have the opportunity to read. It's not at all dry, you know. As I said, it's a really fabulous fiction title with lots of important historical fact in it, and that lovely melding of the two makes it a real gem, I think. Be perfect for schools.
Oh, thanks so much, Sarah. All the three of the books you talked about, I didn't know anything about before. So yeah, so pleased to know about them. So I think we're now staying in Asia, but moving to a different part of the continent. here we are. So we're going to bring Danny back again to talk about this book, which is from Korea.
Thanks. Yes, this is from Korea, as Anne said, and we have in the kind of adult fiction publishing bit, there's been an increase in books from Korea. We've started seeing Korean novels for adults appearing much more in English in the last few years. There's still very little for children. There was a Korean winner of the Astrid Lindgren a couple of years ago by Kina with books like Magic Candles and things. But this is a new book called I Am the Subway, which is a bestseller in Korea, just in English now. By Kim Hyo-eun, who's the writer and illustrator, and translated by Deborah Smith. It's been published by Scribble, which is the children's arm of Scribe, the Australian publisher. And it's a book about a city train, about an underground train. In fact, it's not just about it, it's narrated by an underground train. And it's not a narrative exactly, it's not really linear, it's really just an introduction to the different people who join the train, who board the train on its journey. And the idea is very simply getting to know the people around us whom we might not notice, we might not think about. There is a salesman, there is a grandmother, there's a schoolgirl, there's a father who's running late for something, there is a young man who's looking for a job. And we get a little glimpse at each of these people who are sharing this train carriage, who get on and get off and share this carriage. Each of them has a little bit of their own kind of first person voice. And so the book alternates between the train's voice and each of these characters we meet as they get on. The train's voice is surprising as a narrator, but it's a really nicely controlled, rhythmic bit of prose by this translator, Deborah Smith, who's a great translator from Korean. The author illustrator in her bio at the back talks about a moment in her life when she started to notice details and hands and elbows and gestures and faces and things, and the book is full of detail, full of kind of half revealed bits of characters, glimpses of bits of characters who slowly get kind of revealed over the course of the book. And this is done partly through some really clever and rather lovely use of color. It's all watercolor, but what she's done is it alternates between the, again, I'll show you if you can see a little bit on the screen as I hold it up. The bits of the train which begin reasonably black and white grayscale color. And when we see the characters' lives, as we get introduced to these characters, you suddenly get some very bold, this is what the character's life actually is like when we get to know them. And the pictures of the train become increasingly colorful as we get through, and as these characters move from being these sort of slightly shadowy, slightly silhouette-y figures to people whom we've met and whom we've got to know and who have a kind of color to them. And so even these kind of very basic, a picture of 16 people sitting in a train carriage becomes really rich and really detailed as we get to know them. It's very, it's urban, and it's not always sort of lovely and pretty. It's also mobile phones and the smell of sweat on the train. It's all kind of quite gritty aspect of the pictures being portrayed. But there's also that lovely thing, I think, for reading and for talking about, which I think is true about the next one I'm going to talk about as well, which is a bit the same and a bit different. There are aspects of it that will be unfamiliar, including things like the color palette, but the way people dress and what they're doing and the names of the places. And then there are all the things that any of us who's ever been, lived on the Northern Line for quite a lot of my life, anyone who has been on, urban transport will also recognize the things that are the same and that are familiar to us, even if we haven't been on the public transit system in Seoul. The last thing I'll say is that it's reasonably text heavy. It's quite a lot of text because it jumps between these various narrators. The publisher puts it at ages it at 5 to 11, which I don't really quite know what that means, but it's a really nice read aloud. I have read it aloud just to myself for my entire benefit, and it's a really nice read aloud text. So I am the Subway, Kim Hyo-eun, translated by Deborah Smith, published by
Yeah,
Scribner.
I mean, I have seen this book. I've got myself a copy of it. In fact, I think I saw it recommended. I can't remember, it might be in the World Kidlit people recommended it, and it made me think I'd really like to give that to children alongside Milo Imagines the World. Have you seen that book, which is a lovely picture book, which is also set on a subway. It's an American book, and just so children have those two books side by side. And I think Deborah Smith's quite an interesting translator, isn't she? Didn't she taught herself Korean, I think?
Yeah, she was the first translator to win the International Booker in 2016 with the book called The Vegetarian, and I think this is her first children's book. She's translated The Vegetarian by Han Kang, a great Korean writer. Deborah did 2 more of her books, and a couple of books by Bae Swa, another Korean contemporary Korean novelist. I think this is her first picture book, but she's also the founder of Tilted Axis Press, so she also publishes a lot of great contemporary writing from Asia, adult writing from Asia.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah. Okay, so I'm not sure I'm going to go the right way with this. So staying in Asia but moving to Japan, I think.
Yes, this is also me. Okay, Temple Alley Summer by Sachiko Kashiwaba, illustrated by Miho Satake and translated by Ava Fisher-Odegawa. This is published again in American publishers, Yonder, which is an imprint, is the children's imprint of Restless Books. Sachiko Kashiwaba, I gather, is a very big deal in Japanese children's books. There's one story of hers published a couple of years ago in Words Without Borders, published in English, a curious fairy tale-ish sort of story, which is where I read her for the first time, and I was delighted to be introduced to her, and even happier to be sent this book at proof a year or so ago. It's one of those books that felt like a real discovery coming out of not only a writer I didn't know, but a literature for children I didn't know very well at all. A new girl arrives in Kazu's class. This is how the story basically begins. I say arrives, she kind of appears more than arrives. Arrives isn't quite the right word. There's something very strange about her. She might be a ghost. We're not sure if she's a ghost, but there's something strange not only about her, but also about the way everybody behaves around her. It is a sort of ghost story, though not a scary one. It's a sort of rather existential one. But it's also about Kazu, this boy, solving a kind of long-standing mystery. So it's a sort of quest, though it's not a quest that involves going very far. It's paced sometimes like it has that kind of narrative urgency at some points, like a quest, but it's also leisurely at times, really lovely storytelling, really lovely paced storytelling. It has a story within a story, which is also one of the drivers, because there's a story that within the context of the novel had been published in a magazine long ago, and one of the things that the main character is trying to do is find out how that story ends. So it's also about that kind of urgency. There is a mysterious temple. There is a whole world that I know very little about, and it's very rich in the kind of presentations of this culture, even to the point that Avery, the translator, kept a really large number of Japanese words. So it's not only names and place names and the obvious things like food, but there are quite a lot of Japanese words which is kept in the translation. But again, rather like the Korean book I was talking about a moment ago, it's a very lovely mix of, things that feel culturally interesting to those of us who don't know Japan and so forth, but also a lot that's actually very familiar, because it's a book about friendship. It's a book about trying to do the right thing, even though it's very tempting not to. It's a book about believing or not believing. It's a book about sacrifice. It's got some really beautifully drawn characters, and not just Kazu and Akari, who's the girl, but also every minor person in this book, and one not at all minor cat, I have to mention, because the cat is important. And I think that's it. It's great. I was very pleased. It won the Bachelor Medal a few weeks ago, which I was delighted to see. And I hope that means that we're going to have more Sachiko Kashiwaba books.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. Okay, so just move on now. I think we're leaving Asia now. I think we're moving to Australia.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm going to ask Becky to come back and tell us about this book, which is a book that was very important to her as a child, I understand?
Very. Right. This is Jodie's journey. The protagonist is Jodie, who is about, I think, 12 or 13. I remember the second cover. And she has juvenile arthritis. But it was the first book that I remember reading at the age of 9 in 1991 that had a protagonist in a wheelchair, even though she didn't have the same conditions as me. She was in a wheelchair, she was educated at mainstream school, and she was expected to be able, but she still faced a huge amount of isolation, loneliness, and different and taunting. And having Teely explore those things and explore some of the realities of pain and stiffness, particularly for a teenager and a young child, was absolutely huge. It's the first book I ever remember reading, and I've now read a lot, that has a kid in an electric wheelchair at any point in the book. And at one point, and this actually happened to me some years later, she is walking down the school corridor. By walking, I mean wheeling, but I never use wheeling because people never know what it means. She's wheeling down the school corridor and she's going a little bit fast, and a teacher's coming the other way and doesn't see her because the height is different, and the teacher ends up in her lap in the middle of the corridor, which is both embarrassing and funny. And she has an amazing relationship with her horse, because she, unlike me, is a very passionate rider, and she finds freedom on the back of her horse. And the ending is when he is threatened by bushfire, and she, with her disability, has to be the one to find a way to get him out, because she happens to be home alone when she realizes the extent of the bushfire. Now, that was also empowering, because quite often in disability work, it's fairly rare that the protagonist, that A, there is a fully disabled protagonist, and B, that they have any agency in emergency. And I was so utterly empowered by this book. It's affected me deeply as a 9-year-old kid, and it still affects me now. I really wish they'd bring it back into print here so that we could share it with more kids, because I'm sure they would get something out of it. Actually, my personal copy, which I begged my aunt to get me a second one of, is currently not at my house, because I think I've lent it to a teaching student who loved it when I was coaching her for the 11 plus when she was 11. So I think that's where mine is, and I need to get it back. But it's a really special book. Please get hold of it. It's worth it.
Oh, thanks, Mary. I just wonder what you thought about, because when we were speaking about this a couple of days ago, I'd put one of these covers onto the PowerPoint, and I mentioned that I'd seen several others, so I went back and added them in, and they're all quite different. I don't know if you've got any comments about the covers.
Right. The first one is most accurately Australian bushfire, probably, and would more than likely appeal more to the horse-loving market. The second and third one to me, a more realistic of depictions of how she would feel when she fell out of the wheelchair, and how disempowered she is when she's not in it. And the fourth one is lovely but ridiculously romantic and doesn't feel relevant to the story to me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. And I think this is an author who is famous in Australia, but I think his book Storm Boy has been published here, but he's not very known here, I don't think. So we're going to stay sort of in that part of the world, and we're going to move now to New Zealand, and we're going to welcome Nicola, who is coming to us from New Zealand. So I'll just tell you a little bit about her. She's the Associate Professor at the University of, is it Waikato, you pronounce it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and she's the co-director of the Waikato Picture Book Research Unit, and she co-edited Children's Literature in a Multiliterate World, along with our own Pam Dix and Livy Limbrick, and that is a collection of articles which came out of the IBBY Congress in 2016 in New Zealand. So welcome, Nicola. Who for her it's Thursday morning. So
right.
Yeah.
Kia ora koutou. Greetings from New Zealand, and thank you to Anne for letting me be part of this. I thought it was such a good idea, and through Pam, because I was in touch with Pam about something else, I saw it happening and thought, oh, I want some New Zealand books to be in there if possible. So thank you for having me, and very interesting to hear all the other speakers as well. Before I tell you about the two books I've chosen, I just want to give you a little bit of background to the publisher. I chose two books that I love, and then I realized they both had the same publisher, and I'll just put the publisher's website in the chat to everybody, so you can see. The publisher is called Huia. It was established, it's named after a very precious tail feather of a now extinct bird, but the tail feather was black with a white tip and was worn by very important people in tribes of Māori people, the indigenous people of New Zealand. And so this publishing company was established in 1991, and so it's celebrating 30 years at the moment, and its goal is to provide a platform for Māori voices to be heard in the literary landscape. It produces books for adults and children, but obviously I'm looking at children's books here, and often the children's books that are produced are published both in English and in Māori at the same time. We have an education system in Māori, the Māori language in New Zealand, as well as an English medium school system. And the founder of this, the founders, Robin and Brian Barge, of this publishing company, that was one of their main, the things that drove them really, that their motivation was to ensure that children both heard stories that were relevant to the Māori world, but also had resources available to them in the Māori language. So as I said, a lot of the books come out in two languages at the same time. And then the other thing to tell you about is that both of these books have been winners of the Supreme Award at the New Zealand Book Awards for Children and Young Adults, called the Margaret Mahi Book of the Year. And of course, this award is named after probably New Zealand's most famous children's author, Margaret Mahi, who won the Hans Christian Andersen Award in 2006 and sadly passed away in 2012. Her very first picture book, that's very much a classic in New Zealand, is A Lion in the Meadow, published in 1969, but you may be more familiar with her novels, The Haunting and The Changeover, which were both Carnegie Award winners. So she's a very inspirational figure in New Zealand children's literature, and there are several awards named after her. But both of the books today are award winners. They won their category in the New Zealand Book Awards for children and young adults, and then from those category winners, one book wins the overall award, the Margaret Mahy Book of the Year, and both of these books won that. So first of all, we've got Charlie Tangaroa and the Creature from the Sea, which, as you can see, and we've got both the English and the Māori version on the slide there. This won the Junior Fiction Award before it then was nominated as won the Margaret Mahy Book of the Year Award. So it's a junior fiction novel. It's set in the east coast of New Zealand, and we have the protagonist was born with part of one of his legs not there, and he wears a prosthesis, and you can see that in the cover if you look into the middle of the maelstrom that's on the cover there. So he's in a beach cleanup with his brother, and they find a mermaid on the sea, or a ponaturi. The Māori word is ponaturi. It's not quite the equivalent of a mermaid, but that's how it's being translated. And she was washed up in the sea and looking really ill, and they gather her up and find a saltwater pool to keep her in. And essentially, then the community that they're part of experiences an earthquake, and then there's a tsunami warning, and they have to go to high ground. And essentially, as the novel proceeds, Charlie discovers, the mermaid starts talking to Charlie, and he can hear what she says. He understands what she says, and she believes that he's the one that can stop what's happening. There's a port being planned to be built in their community, and the earthquakes and sort of wild winds that happen as a result of the degradation of the ocean, and the gods of the ocean and this fighting, really, because of this threat to the ocean. And the mermaid tells Charlie that he is the one who can solve this problem. And so he begins a journey to reunite the gods and realize the power of the ancient songs his grandfather has taught him. And it's a really, I love this book because of the blend of contemporary life and myth, and it brings mātauranga Māori, or a Māori view of knowledge, into understanding the present day. I love the way it addresses environmental issues as part of the story. I've just come from another Zoom earlier this morning that was a lecture about climate literature, and I think that this it doesn't fit exactly, but it's in the same ballpark. So that's why I chose this book to talk to you about. The author, Tanya Roxburgh, has tribal affiliations to Ngāti Porou, Ngāti Mutunga o Wharekauri, and she's an award-winning author of more than 30 published works, fiction and non-fiction. She teaches English and is a writing mentor and judge for short stories, and she's also been a judge in the New Zealand Book Awards for children and young adults. I think she's currently taking a sabbatical from writing, actually, I think, a sabbatical from teaching, because she's writing her next piece. So that's the first one. And if we could go to the next slide, Anne. The second book I've chosen is The Bomb by Sasha Cotter, written by Sasha Cotter, illustrated by Josh Morgan. I was at the awards when this book won, and I was so hoping it won the Picture Book Award for the year, and then it won the Supreme Margaret Mahy Book of the Year. I don't know, in New Zealand, when you go to the beach in the summer, there's usually a pier or a jetty that you can go to, and you jump off it and make a big splash, and we call that doing a bomb. So this isn't about war or anything. This is about doing a bomb off the off the edge of a pier in the summer. And it also has a Māori language version, Te Pōhu, published at the same time. So this is set in a small community by the sea, and the main protagonist is watching all these people in his community doing these amazing bombs and thinking and trying to work out how he's going to do his bomb, do a really good bomb. And he goes around and gets advice from all different members of his family and members of the community about how to do a really good bomb. And really, the theme of the book is about being yourself, because his nan, his grandmother, tells him just be yourself in the end. He tries to do all these fancy tricks and things that people tell him to do, and it really is a bit of a flop. And then his nan says, look, you need to just do what you need to be who you are. Oh, I just read your note, Daniel. I'll come back to that. And he does a most amazing bomb at the end, and I love the writing is perfectly parsed and with great rhythm. It's not rhyming, but I've read it aloud many times. It's beautiful to read. It's that beautiful mix of image and text that makes a terrific picture book. The illustrations are just so colourful and alive and vibrant. Sasha Cotter and Josh Morgan actually met through writing and illustrating books together at Huia Publishers, and have actually are a couple and have a child. And actually on the day they won this award, they took their baby up on stage as well, which was lovely. Sasha is a graduate of, she has a teaching and learning diploma and has taught in New Zealand and Spain, and has other both of them have published other picture books. Josh Morgan is Te Aitanga Mahaki and Rongo Whakata. Those are his tribal affiliations. He's an illustrator, writer and designer with a Bachelor of Design. And he does other things. He illustrates other things other than picture books. This is one of my favorite books. I took it with me to Arizona when I visited there a few years ago and shared it with children there, and they loved it. They absolutely loved it. They could relate to it, even though we were actually in a landlocked state at the time. But I know the person I gave it to in Arizona, one of my colleagues, she took it with her to a meeting, and somebody looked over and said, oh, the bomb, that's a funny thing to have a child's book about. And of course, in this book has been published in the US as Cannonball, because that's what it's called. To do a bomb in the US is called Cannonball. So that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks so much for that, Nicola, and thanks for coming all that way. I'm going to stop screen sharing now, so hopefully I'll be able to see you all. There you are, yeah. And just before, and I can see there's quite a few things in the chat which I haven't seen yet. I just thought, sent a message earlier today to Sarah and Danny, because they both very modestly not said they would talk about books that they'd respectively published or translated. And I said, if you want to just talk about a book that you are about to publish or about to be published, you're both very welcome to just say something about, promote something you've done or just about to do. Do one of you want to just talk about a book you just published, or something that's just about to be published that you particularly...
I shall leap in with a book that we're publishing this summer called The Mystery of the Missing Mum. And it's a debut novel by a woman called Frances Maloney. And Frances used to work in children's book sales. And I met her when she looked after the Pushkin list at Bounce, the Salesforce Bounce. And she said to me one day, oh, I'm writing a book, and would you be interested in having a look? And I said, oh, of course I would. I mean, editors love those conversations, because it's like you never know what you're going to get. And she sent in the first draft of The Mystery of the Missing Mum, and it is absolutely delightful. It's the story of Jake, who's 12 years old, secondary school, rather a kind of eccentric young man who wakes up one Monday morning and his mum isn't home, but his grandma is sitting in the kitchen, and that's not normal. What on earth is going on? And he decides he has to turn detective and work out where his mum is. And you quickly realise that Jake's a slightly unreliable narrator. because there's an awful lot that Jake seems to remember in snippets, which is very relevant to where his mother is, but he's sort of not putting 2 and 2 together and making 4. He's busy chasing red herrings all over the place. And his mother has a mental health disorder, which has meant that she's been hospitalized, and he and it has happened before, and he is trying to make something of a drama out of her disappearance, imagining that she's run away to Barbados and all sorts of things, while slowly piecing together the truth. And he does in the end realize what's going on, and that he has been in this situation before. And it's a really, really wonderful book. It's a great adventure story. It's funny, it's touching, it's about friendship, it's about school dramas, it's about eccentric grandmothers, it's about this great boy and his older sister. And Frances wrote it very much inspired by her own upbringing, with a mother who also suffered the same sorts of issues that the mother in this novel deals with, and that of course impact on the family. It's a really kind book. And I think it does something very special, and it's a great adventure story with a lot of love and tact and humor and, as I say, adventure, but deals with an issue that is very relevant for so many of us, and does it in such a kind and sensitive and thoughtful way. It's a special book, and that we're publishing that, I want to say May, but it might be July. But anyway, it's coming this summer. And I just read because it's a good one. The Mystery of the Missing Mum by Frances Maloney.
Okay, thanks. And Danny, is there something you've recently translated you'd like to tell us about?
I can say a couple of words about something which I'm just finishing at the moment, which is a YA novel, which I can't really advertise to you unless you happen to be in North America, because it's only being published in North America at the moment, and published by a small Canadian publisher in August, and a co-translator and I are finishing work on it at the moment. It's by a Portuguese writer called Ana Pessoa, who's written a lot of different kinds of children's and YA books in Portugal. She was one of the Hay Festival's Oris 39 writers. This is a novel called Mary John. It's a young adult-ish novel with some lovely illustration as well. And it's the story of a 16-year-old girl who moves town and therefore moves school and therefore finds a new boyfriend. And in one sense, it's as ordinary as that sounds, except it's all voice and character, and the thing that, you know, it does, nothing in the plot is unusual, really. There's a party, they go to the cinema at one point, they sit at the ice cream parlor at the mall, but it's all voice. It's a really lovely piece of writing, with an incredibly light touch, really delicately done, very simple writing in lots of ways, but very subtle things that make the voice interesting and make the relationships between this girl, Mary John, and each of her parents, her relationship with her grandmother, her relationship with each of her friends. It's not just the characters are detailed, it's the relationships between them. And so it's quite a hard book to persuade people that it's amazing, because it's not about anything terribly unusual. But it's I think it's completely delightful. It's incredibly readable, and sort of seductively simple, I think. And if you happen to be in Toronto, you can buy it in August. I think they're distributing around North America, but it's from a Portuguese publisher called Planeta Tangerina, who are, I think, favorite publishers of mostly picture books from Portugal. But they've done a lot of Anna's books, including they have an imprint which includes some older books, and this is on it. Wow. So yeah, Mary John is what it's called.
Oh, thanks for that. Yeah. So yeah, Planeta Tangerina, they're got such an interesting list of picture books. I wasn't aware that they did books for older readers as well. So now, I'm just going to look and see if anybody's got any questions in the. And it's more just people just making comments. So has anybody got any questions for the speakers or comments? I can't see you all at the same time because there's 33 people. No, 31 now. A couple of people have gone. So I'll just. We can do the yellow hand, but I know not everybody's comfortable with that. So I think. Farah,
Yes.
can you put your hand up? Yeah. Okay, go on.
I was just going to ask, and this is, I sadly missed the first one, and it is true that we can now have translation on the Carnegie and the Greenaway lists, but to Sarah and Daniel, is the landscape a bit better? It seemed to me that there was a sort of whoosh, and I'm a bit worried that there's a sort of another step backwards, because of course the Nosy Crow, the book trust project has folded, hasn't it? And so I don't seem to see quite so many books saying translated from at the moment. Are we still moving forward, or is it a little bit wobbly again, sadly?
I'd be curious to know what Sarah thinks. I mean, I feel like that one of the things that brought it forward a few years ago was the arrival of a lot of publishers in this part of in this bit of publishing. And as far as I know, pretty much all of the people who were doing this 5 years ago are still here. What was really interesting at the time, I thought, was how much the change was brought about not by a lot of big children's publishers suddenly starting publishing work in translation, but a lot of publishers who do work in translations beginning children's lists. And Pushkin is a really nice example of that. Yonder, which is one of the publishers I waved at you. Scribble, in fact, another publisher I waved at you. They're both publishers who've been doing work for adults in translation and moved into the children's part of the market elsewhere in the US, are another example of that. And there was a little wave, I think, of Pushkin was probably slightly earlier than some of the picture book ones, of publishers who, because their experience was publishing work in translation for adults, they had some of the contacts with international publishers, they had some expertise in the things that are quite difficult about publishing work in translation, which is, it has its own particular challenges. What I haven't seen is the kind of big, more obviously commercial publishing houses who publish, 50 children's books a year, starting to do international work. I haven't seen any noticeable movement there. With the presence of independent publishers, a lot of whom, as I say, have moved into children's rather than being in children's and moving into translation. That feels like it's still fairly well.
Yes, but so how can we get? I mean, some of these. I mean, I was looking the subway train one. Looks wonderful, and the bomb. I mean, well, I know it's not it is translated because it's in the dual language. There are illustrations that would work here, and I just find it extraordinary that some of these, the Temple Alley one sounds as if it would really work. How do we get people to pick them up? How do we get?
Well, I think the thing is that each publishing house has its own editorial tastes and drive. And you know, as a publishing house, Pushkin, Bloomsbury, wherever it is, HarperCollins, Penguin, we buy books that we feel we understand how to sell. We buy books that we feel we can communicate well to an audience, to booksellers, and ultimately to readers. Wild Witch, the books that were mentioned earlier on, which we've published in the UK. Well, the first one was shortlisted for Waterstone's Book Prize. So I do think that there's much greater acceptance of books in translation for young readers now. Letter for the King that we publish at Pushkin, we've sold so many copies of that. I mean, it's been a bestseller for us at Pushkin. It's tens and tens and tens of thousands, and it's just wonderful. But I think there are still hurdles. A big one, of course, is a lack of availability of an author. And in the children's book world, the books that we see sell best have an author very much driving that and being part of that process, doing school events. Admittedly, the pandemic aside, the last couple of years, possibly not quite so much, but authors during this time have done a huge amount on Zoom, and schools tend to invite people that are local, that who are known to the audience already. So an author like Ellie Fountain, who we're publishing our 4th book with Pushkin this year, has done incredibly well because Ellie works really, really hard in terms of getting out and going and doing events in schools and talking to children and communicating with the audience. And often books in translation, I mean, for very obvious reasons, that can be a very difficult thing to achieve. A lot of the authors don't speak English. Why should they? They live far away. We can't afford to bring them unless their book's a bestseller. And so you're caught in this kind of snake eating its own tail circus of issues. But I do think the UK market is getting much better at accepting books in translation. I mean, I've been publishing really ridiculously long time. And I remember wanting to publish certain authors all those years ago and salespeople saying to me, oh, no, we can't do that. We cannot publish an author that the audience can't say their name. Yeah. And so, you know, we've moved forward.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it seems to me, I mean, I was looking at my list of Oxford University Press books from the 70s and 60s and 70s. An enormous number of those were translated, actually, you know, Bauman and the Jewish, the other Russian writers. But then, of course, in those days, you didn't expect to see the author.
And also,
I mean, I didn't meet an author till
Frank and say you probably didn't expect to sell very many copies. What you hoped is the book would backlist. Whereas now children's publishing is so much more dominated by actually where are the numbers? Because if we're not selling the books in big enough numbers, we can't justify continuing to try to publish that author. You know, children's publishing in the last 20, 30 years has really become a very commercial operation. And in the past, it was often a kind of an add-on list to an adult publishing house. And you did it because it was the right thing to do. It was kind of vocational or worthy rather than actually, it's a proper commercial business, children's publishing.
Has anyone else got?
Just continue to work.
Pam, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I have. There's a couple of points that I'd like to make, really, because I think about this endlessly. One is it's a kind of distribution question or point, really, because I think Enchanted Lion, who've been mentioned, and Elsewhere editions are doing really terrific translations, and they've got a kind of remit to produce the world's books in good quality editions. So it would be great to see those books being more easily available in the UK. And I'm not quite sure why their distribution is a bit stymied. I don't quite understand that point. So, I mean, Danny, you might know something about that. And my other point is that I really take what Sarah says about the kind of quest to meet the author, but I would love it if publishers could look at some of the award-winning titles, even if it was just the Hans Christian Andersen award-winning authors and illustrators, just to have a glance through that and see if there are any people there that have won things. Because I always find it so just frustrating when I get to Bologna, for example, and look at the Ragazzi Prize and see these wonderful books and think, you know, this has won their, you know, quite a kind of, it's quite a strict process, or the Hans Christian Andersen is probably the strictest process there is in the world, and we can't read those books in English. So I mean, I just think awards are a shortcut, really. But I'm just a bit intrigued, Danny, if you've got any comments about Elsewhere and Enchanted Lion's distribution.
I've not worked with Enchanted Lion. I know the Elsewhere people pretty well. We've done a few books together. Did a lovely interview of one of the illustrator authors I've worked with a lot, Roger Mallow, very recently. We've done 3 books together for Elsewhere. Elsewhere is the children's imprint of Archipelago Books, who've been publishing adult books in translation for about 20 years in the US. And they have some distribution here, but not very much. But what's quite interesting, I think, about their situation, and I think this it's partly a distribution question and also some other things. One of the problems we have, I think, I mean, I agree with everything Sarah said about the particular challenges of having authors, for example, to promote books here in the UK. But I think there is a very different situation with picture books, which I think we do in translation much worse in the UK. It's very hard to think of a publisher here of picture books that has a consistent record of publishing work in translation. What we have is better or worse distributed versions of things from Gecko in New Zealand, things from Enchanted Lion in the US, or whoever it may be. And I think one of the things behind that is that these small independent publishers are trying to publish right across the English-speaking world, rather than in a small territory. And one of the reasons for this, as I understand it, is because trying to publish a picture book in English which you can't co-edition, essentially. It's a conversation I've had with so many times with picture book publishers at, you know, PRH and the other big houses, that so much of the business model of, if you're going to make a book commercially viable at kind of picture book level, depends on being able to co-edition. And if you can't do that because you're limited to one language, because the book already has a life in lots of other languages, the only possible hope you have is basically being a single publisher trying to sell copies right across the English-speaking world, which is the only reason Tate, I mean, when Tate do picture book and translation, they get world English rights and they sell as broadly across the English-speaking world as they can. But it does mean that the publishers are then at the mercy of whatever distribution they've got. And I think what we find is often, I mean, Bounce was mentioned already, and I think Bounce have got quite a few. I think they might have Gecko actually. They represent quite a few of the Anglophone publishers around the world who do work in translation. But it's obviously the publisher can only be as good as the distribution they have if they don't have people on the ground, and if they don't have the authors on the ground who are going into schools and festivals and all those things.
Yes, I have heard Julia Marshall talk about the importance of distribution in the work that she does, because Gecko Press, for those of you who don't know, is based in Wellington, but it's run. Julia Marshall is the founder and director, and she the whole premise of her publishing company is to purchase the rights for books that are not in English, and that have been are not in English, and then she has them translated into English, and then she sends them back out into the world. She also has an aspect of her publishing company that's about publishing books in New Zealand into Māori, and also publishing some New Zealand authors. But the central foundation of her publishing company, as I understand it, is to make English versions of really wonderful books that exist around the world, just as you're talking about making them available, all these wonderful books that are being written to the English reading audience.
They do. I mean, some of them, my favorite books that I've worked on have been Gecko books. They have, I mean, I love their taste and I love what they do. They also suffer from the problem, I think, in a lot of places, that they have pretty good distribution. They're quite visible. A lot of their books have done quite well. You know, the last book I did with them particularly sold in the US. It didn't do terribly well here, but sold very well in the US. But they have the problem that, for example, they're sufficiently a UK publisher, even though they're based in Wellington, to have books on shelves. They're not sufficiently a UK publisher to be eligible for a lot of the big prizes. And so a lot of the publishers that are distributing across territories, some of them I think quite well, and some of them I think not terribly well, are very often, even if they are as present in a bookshop as a, if you're like a domestic publisher, they don't have the access to things like prizes. And
that's why translation prizes are so important, isn't it?
But it's something which comes, and we have this, I'm on the advisory panel for the Booker prizes, one of which is for translation and one of which is English language. And one of the conversations we always have is, how do we deal with the fact that there are publishers which happen, by a quirk of whatever, usually the founder's biography, to have their registered office in Amsterdam or Wellington or anywhere else. But actually, apart from the fact that their registered office is there, they are publishing into the UK market in exactly the same way as a UK publisher is publishing in the UK market. But they somehow don't count as, they're not eligible for a lot of these big prizes. So it's a curious, quite hard to get round kind of artificial boundary that's put around them.
Had this frustrating experience with our nominations for the Greenaway, I think it was, the Peter Sis, Nikki and Vera, which is a book that everyone should know and have here, is technically published in the States, even though they have a publishing address in the UK, and it was a simultaneous publication. It was not eligible by, and that was so frustrating because it's such an extraordinary book. Anyway, thanks, Danny, that's really helpful.
Anyone else got any?
And I just wanted to ask, I think it was Sarah who mentioned it, is Ruby's book being published here at all? The African one?
We haven't got a UK publisher for it yet. It's out on submission through the agent Julia Churchill at AM Heath.
Oh, great. But can you, there's a young person I know who needs that book. Like,
I can, Rebecca, let's, if you get my email address from Anne,
right, fine.
Let's talk on email and I can send you what I can send you.
Yeah, there's someone I know who really needs it.
Good. She shall have it, or he shall have it.
Yeah. But there is a US edition, yeah, presumably?
It is, it's a US edition at the moment. Obviously Ghanaian writer, Ghanaian set, but published only by Norton Books for young readers.
Oh, do you know a book which I only just heard about called the Ghanaian, I think it's called the Ghanaian Cinderella.
No, I don't know that.
There's some English schoolhouse publishing in Texas are doing it.
Text in Australia?
No, Texas in America. There's a publishing house called English Schoolhouse Publishing.
Okay, I'm going to look it up.
And I only just heard about it, but it's, bearing in mind I have very little knowledge of Africa, but I was asked to get it for school, a primary school with kids with very particular medical needs.
Okay.
And I read some of it, and some of the African dialect wasn't very well explained. So I basically said, we get it for them to use in school, but not with all the parents, because some could use it, but some would find that a barrier.
Okay, I'll look it up. And let's talk on email, Rebecca, because I maybe there's some other things. And I'm going to do a terrible thing, and I'm so sorry, but I'm going to bow out because I'm now 2 minutes late for another Zoom.
Oh, right. Well, we were aiming to finish around now anyway, so I just see if anybody else has got any other questions. But thanks so much, Sarah. And I'll put you and Becky in touch with each other. Don't worry.
And really wonderful to hear everybody talk about their wonderful books. As always, inspiring. My list is quite long now for things that I have to get hold of. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh, thanks so much, Sarah.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everyone.
Now, I always say about an hour and a half on Zoom is usually about enough. So, but if anybody has got any other burning comments or questions, obviously we can just take those now. If not, I'm going to ask Pam if she'll just talk a bit about our next event, perhaps, because that's coming up quite soon.
You've caught me on the hot.
Sorry, I didn't. Yes, I should have said I was going to.
I haven't got the date in my head. Do you have the date in your head?
Yeah.
8th of March.
Yeah. Yes.
Sorry.
8th of March.
8th of March. IBBY UK seminar with Christine Hello. Hello. Wonderful speaker. Everybody join.
It's on the website, but it comes under news rather than events for some reason. But it's if you look under the news bit of the IBBY UK website.
Yes, I'm really sorry. I didn't have the date in front of me.
Yeah, so, sorry, I should have said I was going to.
Yes, Christine Hello is a professor in Belgium, and she writes about living in a multilingual world and speaks absolutely brilliantly about the whole concept of publishing books for a multilingual concept. and she was going to speak for us in January, but her husband was very ill at that moment, so we agreed to delay it until March, and hopefully she will feel calmer and able to give the presentation more. She spends quite a lot of time in England, so we were hoping to have her at our actual conference, but many of us heard her speak at the IBBY Europe conference in Bologna, and we were enormously impressed with what she said, so it should be a very good talk. And she's going to do a straight talk and then take questions at the end, so look forward to seeing as many of you as possible there. And just to say thank you to Anne for this evening, for organising it, and for everyone who's contributed and all their books. I just, like Sarah, feel that, wow, I just want to get hold of these books now and I want to read. And I've been completely addicted to Abir Mukherjee's Detective, so I'm now going to definitely find the Chowpatty one. I love books that set real, fiction in a real time with real people, so that sounds great. And it's wonderful to span the world in a Zoom. Thank you, Nikki, for joining us. So lovely to see everyone.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks so much for everybody who's contributed. Thanks. And yeah, and
bye, everyone.
Yeah. Okay, so hope to see you again soon. Yeah.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye. Katerina, I'd like to get your address sometime.
Okay, so that's some more people have got to put in touch with each other. Okay. Yeah.
Bye. And thank you, Anne. Brilliant.